My father handed my half-brother the keys to a business our grandfather built with his own two hands, and he did it in front of the entire family, at the same dinner table where I had eaten every Thanksgiving of my childhood. He didn't ask me to leave the room first. He didn't pull me aside afterward to explain. He simply set the keys down next to Derek's plate, cleared his throat, and said four words that I have replayed so many times in the last 15 years that they've worn smooth, like a stone kept in a pocket. He's the one who stayed. That was it. That was the whole explanation. 26 years of birthdays, holidays, phone calls on Sunday nights, tuition I helped pay out of my own paycheck when Derek dropped out of community college, none of it weighed as much as geography. I had left for the city 11 years earlier. Derek had stayed in the same 5-mile radius his entire life. And on that November evening, staying turned out to be the only qualification my father cared about. I want to tell you I stood up and said something unforgettable. I didn't. I sat there with a fork halfway to my mouth while my stepmother reached over and squeezed Derek's shoulder like he'd just been handed a diploma instead of a company. I put the fork down, folded my napkin, and said the only thing that felt true, okay. Then I drove home in the dark and didn't call again for the better part of a year. What none of them knew, what I didn't fully understand myself yet, is that the story doesn't end at that table. It just goes quiet for a while. 15 years quiet, to be exact. 15 years of Derek running that hardware store into a business he was never trained to run, 15 years of my father calling it, keeping it in the family, and 15 years of me building something 200 miles away that none of them ever thought to ask about. Because they never once asked what I did with my half of nothing. They assumed I'd rented some apartment, found some ordinary job, and quietly faded into the background of a family story that no longer had a part written for me. They should have asked. By the time my father finally picked up the phone again, 15 years later, he wasn't calling to apologize. He was calling because the bank had sent a letter, and the name on the letterhead belonged to a company he had never heard of. He had no idea it was mine. To understand why that dinner table moment cut as deep as it did, you need to understand what Marsh Hardware actually was, not just to the town, but to me. My grandfather, Wallace Marsh, opened the store in 1962 with a loan from a cousin, and a hand-painted sign that still hung above the register when I left for college. It sold nails and lumber and paint the way every small hardware store does, but it also sold something less tangible, the sense that if your pipe burst at midnight or your porch step splintered, there was a Marsh behind the counter who would open the shop early and not charge you extra for the inconvenience. My grandfather ran it that way. My father ran it that way after him. And when I was 9 years old, my father started teaching me to run it too. I don't say that lightly. I spent my childhood Saturdays sweeping sawdust, learning to count a till, memorizing which aisle held which gauge of wire. By 12 I could quote lumber prices from memory. By 15, I was closing the store alone 2 nights a week while my father coached Derek's little league games. Derek was 7 years younger, from my father's second marriage, and in those early years, the age gap meant the store was simply mine to help run and his to be too young for. I didn't resent that. If anything, I liked it. It felt like being trusted with something real. I went to college 2 hours away, but I came home every summer and worked full weeks at the store, the same as always. I majored in business, specifically because I assumed, the way you assume the sun will rise, that Marsh Hardware would eventually be mine to run, or at least mine to co-run, the way my father and his own father had once shared it. I took a small business finance course my junior year specifically because my professor said it would help me modernize the books when the time came. I wrote my senior thesis on rural retail survival strategies, using Marsh Hardware as my case study, with my father's actual sales figures as my data set. He was proud of that thesis. He kept a printed copy in the store's back office for years. After graduation, I did what a lot of ambitious kids from small towns do. I took a job in the city, not because I was leaving the store behind, but because a regional bank had offered me a role in commercial lending, and I told myself, and told my father, that I was going to learn how businesses actually got financed, how they scaled, how they survived recessions, so that I could bring all of it back home eventually and modernize Marsh Hardware the right way. My father seemed to understand that. He'd nod along on our phone calls when I explained amortization schedules or inventory financing, even joking that I was becoming the smart one of the family, which at the time felt like a compliment. For 6 years, I lived that double life. Weekdays in the city, underwriting loans for small manufacturers and family restaurants, learning exactly how fragile, and exactly how salvageable, a struggling local business could be if someone understood its numbers well enough. Weekends, more often than not, I drove the 2 hours home. I helped my father switch the store's ancient paper ledger system to a basic digital one. I helped him negotiate better terms with 2 of his suppliers. When the roof needed replacing and the insurance payout came up short, I was the one who found the contractor willing to do it in 3 phases so the store never had to close. Derek, meanwhile, was in high school, then briefly in community college, then not in community college. He worked the register on weekends the way I once had, but without much interest in the parts of the business that lived behind the counter, the ordering, the margins, the supplier relationships. He was good with customers. Genuinely good. People liked him. He remembered their names and their kids' names, and whether their dog had finally recovered from surgery. That mattered too, and I want to be honest about that, because it matters to how the rest of this story unfolds. By the time I turned 30, I had put together, on my own initiative, a 5-year modernization plan for Marsh Hardware, expanded online ordering, a small contractor supply division, updated point-of-sale systems, even a rough valuation showing what the business could be worth if we grew it the way similar rural hardware stores across the state had. I printed it, bound it, and drove it home myself to show my father, the way you'd bring home a report card you were proud of. I told him I wanted to come back. Not someday. Soon. I wanted to buy in as a partner, formally, the way it had always been assumed I one day would. He told me it was a lot to think about. He said he needed time. I gave him that time, because he was still, in every version of the future I could imagine, my father, and Marsh Hardware was still, in every version I could imagine, partly mine. I should say something here about my mother, because she matters to this story even though she isn't in most of it. She died when I was 11, and for the 4 years between her death and my father's remarriage, the store was the one place that didn't feel like it was missing something. My father worked longer hours than he needed to that stretch, and I came with him more often than a kid probably should have, but I never minded. Sweeping floors next to him felt like company. It felt like both of us were quietly agreeing not to fall apart in the same room. When he remarried and Derek came along 2 years after that, I didn't feel replaced, not at first. I was 15, old enough to babysit, old enough to be useful, and my stepmother, Linda, was kind to me in the practical way that stepmothers who married into an already formed family sometimes are, fair, a little formal, careful never to overstep. She never once told me I wasn't a Marsh. She didn't have to. My last name already said that. What she did do, gradually and without ever announcing it, was make it clear that her son's future and my future were not, in her mind, weighted the same way. Derek needed the store. I, in her telling, had so many other options. I used to hear that phrase, so many other options, the way you hear a compliment that's actually a door closing softly somewhere down the hall. Still, for years, none of that seemed to matter, because my father kept treating the store as something we were building toward together. He'd call me during slow Tuesday afternoons just to talk through a supplier issue, the way you'd call a business partner, not a daughter he was being polite to. He introduced me to other shop owners at the county trade fair, as the one who's going to run this place someday, mark my words. I believed him. I had no reason not to. I had spent 2 decades proving, in every measurable way a person can prove something, that I was capable, invested, and ready. I want to pause here and be fair to Derek, because it would be easy to make him the villain of this story, and he wasn't, not really. Derek didn't ask my father to hand him the business over me. He didn't lobby for it or campaign behind my back. He was 23 years old, uncertain about his own future, and he said yes to something his father offered him, which is a very human thing to do. The unfairness in this story doesn't belong to Derek. It belongs to a decision made above both our heads, by a man who mistook proximity for loyalty, and who never once thought to ask either of us what we actually wanted before he decided it for us. Whatever happened later between me and Derek, it started here, in a choice neither of us made. The call came on a Tuesday in October, 3 weeks before that Thanksgiving. My father asked me to come home for dinner, to talk about the business, and I spent those 3 weeks doing exactly what you'd expect a hopeful 30-year-old to do. I refined my modernization plan. I priced out a small business loan of my own in case he wanted me to buy in gradually rather than all at once, and I told 2 of my closest friends at the bank that I might be leaving the city by spring. I even mentioned it, carefully, to my manager, so she could start thinking about a transition plan for my accounts. I drove home that Thursday with the bound proposal on the passenger seat, next to a bottle of wine I'd picked out for the occasion. I remember the drive because I spent most of it rehearsing, not begging, just explaining, laying out numbers, showing him exactly how a partnership could work financially, how I'd structured similar deals for other family businesses at the bank and watched them thrive. I wanted to walk in prepared, the way I'd been trained to walk into any negotiation. I did not, even once during that 4-hour drive, consider the possibility that there was nothing left to negotiate. The house smelled like the same roast it always did on family dinner nights. Linda had set the table with the good plates, which I registered but didn't think much of. We used the good plates for most family dinners by then. Derek was already there, which was normal. What wasn't normal was the manila envelope sitting at my father's place at the head of the table, unopened, next to his water glass, like it was waiting for a specific moment. We ate. We talked about ordinary things, Linda's sister's surgery, a storm that had knocked a branch onto the store's back awning, whether the homecoming parade route had changed again this year. I kept waiting for an opening, a natural pause where I could bring up my proposal, and I kept not finding one, because my father seemed to be steering the conversation deliberately away from anything resembling business, right up until dessert had been cleared and the coffee had been poured. Then he reached for the envelope. He didn't open it in front of me. He opened it in front of Derek, which was the first detail that told me something was wrong, though I didn't let myself fully understand it yet. Inside were 2 sets of keys, the store's front door and the old delivery van, and a folded piece of paper that I would later learn was a rough outline of an ownership transfer, drawn up not by a lawyer but by my father himself, on a legal pad, the same kind he used for inventory counts. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," he said, and I remember how steady his voice was, how rehearsed, in a way that told me this wasn't a decision he'd made that week. "Your grandfather built this place for the family, who was going to keep it going. And I think I know that's Derek." For a moment I genuinely thought I'd misheard him, or misunderstood the context, the way your mind tries to protect you in the half-second before a fall actually lands. I looked at the proposal sitting in my bag by the door, still bound, still unread by anyone but me, and I looked at my father, waiting for him to turn to me next, to say something like, "And I want you involved too. Or we'll figure out your part in this," or even just a question, "Do you have thoughts on this, Elena?" He didn't turn to me. He set the keys down next to Derek's plate. "He's the one who stayed," he said. Derek looked as stunned as I felt, which I noticed even through the roaring in my own ears. His hand hovered over the keys like he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch them yet. Linda, on the other hand, was already reaching over to squeeze his shoulder, already smiling the specific smile of someone whose long, quiet campaign had finally paid off. I don't know to this day how much of that evening she orchestrated and how much simply fell into place around her, but I know she wasn't surprised. Nobody at that table was surprised except me and, I think, Derek. I sat there with my fork still in my hand. I thought about the 4-hour drive, the rehearsed numbers, the bottle of wine I'd chosen specifically because it was the same one we'd opened the year the store hit its best sales quarter in a decade. I thought about being 9 years old, sweeping sawdust, being told I had good instincts for this. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its finality, that none of it had ever been building toward a partnership. It had been building toward exactly this moment, and I simply hadn't been paying attention to the parts of it that mattered. "Okay," I said. It was the only word I trusted myself to say without it becoming something else entirely. I could feel the shape of everything else pressing behind my teeth, the plan in my bag, the years of Saturdays, the thesis with his own sales figures typed into it, and I knew that if I let any of it out at that table, it would come out as something ugly, something I couldn't take back. So I said the one word that was true and safe at the same time, and I let the rest of it stay exactly where it was. My father nodded, like okay, was the answer he'd been hoping for, the answer that let him believe this had gone smoothly. Derek finally picked up the keys, turning them over once in his palm, and for just a second he looked at me, not triumphant, not smug, just uncertain, like he understood he'd been handed something that wasn't entirely his to take pride in yet. I would think about that look many times over the next 15 years. It was the only honest moment at that table. I drove home that night in the dark, and I didn't cry until I hit the county line, which felt like an oddly specific place for something to finally break, but grief has never once asked my permission about timing. I cried for maybe 20 minutes, the kind of crying that feels less like sadness and more like pressure finally finding an exit. Then I wiped my face, turned the radio up, and by the time I reached the city limits, I had made a decision I wouldn't fully understand the size of for years. I was not going to fight for something that had already been given away. I was going to build something else instead. The first year was the hardest, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of the accumulation of small ones. I didn't call home for 11 months. My father called twice, once on my birthday, a short, stilted conversation about nothing in particular, and once in March, to ask, almost as an afterthought, whether I still had contacts at any lumber wholesalers, because Derek was having trouble negotiating better pricing. I gave him 3 names. I didn't offer anything else, and he didn't ask. At the bank, I kept working, but something in me had shifted. I stopped thinking of my job as a bridge back home, and started thinking of it as the whole road. I asked my manager for more responsibility on the small business lending side, specifically the accounts involving distressed or underperforming local retailers, businesses that were struggling the way I now understood any hardware store could struggle without someone watching the margins closely. I told myself it was professional curiosity. It was also, if I'm honest, the only way I knew how to stay close to something I'd lost without going back to the place that had taken it from me. By year 2, I had been promoted to a senior underwriting role, and I'd started, quietly, on my own time, buying small pieces of distressed commercial real estate, not because I had some grand plan yet, but because I understood the mechanics of it better than almost anyone I knew, and because it gave me something to build with my hands the way the store once had. My first purchase was a half-empty strip mall 2 towns over from the city, bought for a fraction of its value because the previous owner had defaulted during a slow winter. I fixed the roof, found 2 new tenants, and sold it 18 months later for nearly triple what I'd paid. I want to be clear that none of this was about revenge, not at first. It felt, in those early years, like grief with a business plan attached, a way of proving to myself, privately, in numbers nobody at home would ever see, that I hadn't been wrong about my own competence. Every property I stabilized felt like a quiet rebuttal to 4 words I still heard sometimes when I couldn't sleep. Back home, the story moved differently. Derek was trying, genuinely trying, but running a business is not the same as working the register on Saturdays, and my father, for all his pride in keeping it in the family, had never actually taught Derek the parts of the business that mattered most, the supplier negotiations, the seasonal cash flow planning, the margin math on slow-moving inventory. Those were the things I had learned, over 2 decades, almost by accident, because I'd been the one standing next to my father in the back office instead of behind the register up front. Derek had the front-of-house instincts. Nobody had given him the back office ones. I heard fragments of this over the years, mostly secondhand, through my aunt, who still called me occasionally and who, unlike Linda, had never fully understood why the business had gone to Derek in the first place. In year 3, the store missed a supplier payment for the first time in its history, and had to negotiate a short-term extension. In year 4, they lost their longest-standing contractor account, a local builder who'd bought lumber from us for 2 decades, because Derek, trying to be generous, had extended credit to a customer who never paid it back, and the shortfall meant the contractor's order got delayed by weeks during his busiest season. My aunt told me this like it was gossip. I wrote it down like it was data. By year 5, my father had aged in a way that surprised me when I saw a photo and sent, thinner, grayer, tired around the eyes in a way I hadn't seen even after my mother died. The store was still open, but barely profitable, propped up more by habit and community loyalty than by sound management. I felt something complicated when I learned this. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something closer to a bruise being pressed on gently, just to confirm it was still there. Meanwhile, my own trajectory had accelerated in ways that would have seemed impossible to the 30-year-old who drove home with a bound proposal and a bottle of wine. I left the bank in year 6 to start my own small real estate holding company, using the capital I'd built from those first few distressed properties. I named it Harrow Creek Holdings, after a stream that ran behind my grandfather's original store, a detail nobody in my family would have recognized even if they'd seen the name on a piece of mail, because none of them had ever asked what I was building, and I had stopped volunteering it. By year 8, Harrow Creek Holdings owned 11 properties across 3 counties, mostly small commercial spaces in towns not unlike the one I grew up in, the kind of towns where a struggling local business could either be strangled slowly by an absentee landlord or given room to breathe by someone who actually understood what it took to keep a shop alive through a bad winter. I chose, deliberately, to be the second kind of owner. I gave extensions when tenants needed them. I reinvested in roofs and parking lots and heating systems, instead of squeezing rent increases out of businesses that were barely surviving. People who worked with me sometimes asked why I was so patient with struggling tenants when patience wasn't exactly standard practice in commercial real estate. I never told most of them the real answer, which was that I knew, better than almost anyone, what it felt like to watch something you loved get run by people who didn't understand its numbers. By year 10, my father and I had settled into a strange, thin peace, not a reconciliation, exactly, but a kind of détente. I came home for 2 holidays a year, stayed a night, exchanged careful conversation with Derek that never touched the store directly, and left again. He never asked what I did for work beyond a vague understanding that I was in real estate now, and I never corrected the vagueness, because clarity would have required an honesty neither of us was ready for. I noticed on those visits that the store looked tired in a way that photographs hadn't fully captured, paint peeling on the sign my grandfather had hand-painted, the parking lot cracked and unpatched, the shelves noticeably thinner than they'd been in my childhood. Year 11 was when the building's original mortgage came up for renewal, and the regional bank that had carried Marsh Hardware's loan for almost 2 decades quietly decided, as part of a broader restructuring after a merger, to sell off a batch of smaller commercial notes to a private buyer rather than renew them directly. I know this because I still had contacts at that bank, and one of them, an old colleague named Priya, mentioned it to me almost in passing over coffee. She remembered, vaguely, that I'd grown up around a hardware store, and she thought I might find it interesting that one of the notes in the batch belonged to a Marsh Hardware in my home county. I didn't do anything about it for 3 days. I told myself it wasn't my business anymore, that I had built an entire life 200 miles from that store, and I didn't owe it my attention just because an old colleague had mentioned its name. But on the 4th day, I called Priya back and asked her to send me the batch summary, the way you'd ask, casually, about a house you had no intention of buying. I read every line of that summary twice. The note was small by Harrow Creek's standards, well within what I could acquire without disrupting anything else, and it was priced the way distressed rural commercial debt usually is, low, because most buyers in that market didn't want the headache of managing a note attached to a business that might not survive the decade. I bought it under a subsidiary entity, not Harrow Creek Holdings directly, using a name that meant nothing to anyone, Willowbend Note Servicing, specifically so that if my father or Derek ever looked into who now held their mortgage, they would find a name as anonymous as any bank's. I told myself at the time that I was simply doing what I did with every distressed note I picked up, giving the business room to survive, quietly, invisibly, the way I'd done for 11 other tenants and borrowers who never knew my name either. I want to be honest, though, and say that this one felt different the moment the paperwork cleared. My hands were shaking slightly when I signed it, and it wasn't from doubt. Over the next 4 years, I watched that note the way you'd watch a wound you weren't sure was healing. Payments came in late more often than not, never so late that I had grounds to act, but late enough that I could see, month over month, the slow arithmetic of a business losing ground. I extended 2 informal grace periods through Willowbend's servicing arm, without ever contacting the store directly, the way I would have for any struggling tenant. I told myself this was simply good business practice. I also knew, somewhere underneath that explanation, that I was giving my father time I had never actually promised him. Derek, meanwhile, had married in year 12, a woman named Ashley, whom I met exactly once, at a wedding I attended for 4 hours before driving back to the city that same night. He seemed, in the pictures Mayan sent afterward, genuinely happy, and I felt something unexpectedly soft about that, a reminder that whatever had happened at that dinner table years earlier, Derek's life had gone on the same as mine had, shaped by choices and consequences that weren't only about me. He and Ashley had a son the following year, which meant my father, for the first time since my mother died, had a grandchild carrying the Marsh name into a 5th generation neither of us had planned for. By year 14, the signs had become impossible to ignore, even from 200 miles away. My aunt told me the store had cut its hours, closing on Sundays for the first time in its 60-year history. A big-box hardware chain had opened 40 minutes away 2 years earlier, and while Marsh Hardware had survived the initial hit the way most loyal small-town customers ensure a beloved store survives an initial hit, the slow bleed of convenience and lower prices had done what direct competition rarely manages. It had simply worn the business down, one deferred purchase at a time. Willow Bend's servicing reports showed 3 consecutive months of partial payments. I authorized a 4th grace period, the maximum I could extend without triggering an internal compliance review at my own company, and I remember sitting at my desk that evening, looking at the notes file, and understanding, with a clarity that had been building for 14 years, that whatever happened next was going to happen soon, and that I no longer had the option of staying anonymous indefinitely. Year 15 arrived quietly, the way most turning points do, not with a dramatic phone call at first, but with a routine servicing report that landed in my inbox on an ordinary Monday. Marsh Hardware had missed a full payment for the first time in the note's history, not a partial one, not a late one, a full miss, and the report flagged it under our standard escalation protocol, the same protocol Willowbend applied to any borrower regardless of who they happened to be. Under that protocol, a missed full payment triggered a 30-day notice period, followed by a formal default letter if the balance wasn't cured, followed, eventually, by foreclosure proceedings if nothing changed. I had built that protocol myself, years earlier, modeled on the fairest terms I could design, because I never wanted Willowbend to be the kind of lender that buried struggling businesses under fine print. I had never imagined I would be the one reading my own protocol applied to my own family's name. I sat with that report for 2 full days before I did anything. I thought about calling my father directly, informally, the way a daughter might warn a father that trouble was coming. I decided against it, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely didn't yet know what I wanted to do, whether to quietly absorb the missed payment the way I'd absorbed the others, whether to finally step forward and offer help under my own name, or whether some harder, older part of me wanted to let the process run exactly as it would for any other borrower, and see, once and for all, whether the business my father had chosen to protect could survive without my invisible hand underneath it. On the 3rd day, I let the standard 30-day notice go out under Willowbend's letterhead, the same letterhead every other borrower received. I told myself I was simply following my own rules. I also knew, as I authorized it, that this was the letter that would eventually land on my father's kitchen table, the one with a company name he wouldn't recognize, attached to a debt he could no longer quietly outrun. I spent that 30-day window the way I imagine most people spend the countdown to a decision they've already half made without admitting it, restless, distracted, running the same conversation in my head a dozen different ways depending on my mood that hour. Some days I imagined simply forgiving the balance outright, and never saying a word about who had done it. Other days, older and less generous days, I imagined letting the process run its full course, foreclosure and all, just to prove, finally and completely, that a decision made without me could unravel entirely without me too. Neither impulse felt like the whole truth. By day 26, my aunt called to tell me, in the same gossiping cadence she'd used for 14 years of second-hand updates, that my father had aged noticeably in the past week, that he'd started sleeping badly, that Derek had mentioned, once in passing, that he didn't know how he was going to tell his own son someday that the business carrying his family's name for 60 years had slipped through his hands. I didn't sleep well that night either. The notice went out on a Thursday. My father called me on a Sunday, 11 days later, and it was the first time in 15 years I had heard real fear in his voice instead of pride or distance or careful neutrality. Elena. He said my name like he wasn't sure I'd still answer to it from him. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you know anything about a company called Willowbend? I stood very still in my kitchen, phone against my ear, and I understood that this was the moment everything I had built quietly for 15 years was about to stop being quiet. I could have lied. It would have been easy, a simple no, followed by a sympathetic question about what was wrong, and I could have bought myself more time to decide what kind of person I wanted to be in this story. I thought about it for exactly as long as it took him to say my name a second time, softer, almost pleading. Elena, please. The store is going to lose the building. Derek doesn't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I don't have anyone else to ask. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same kind of table, I realized, where he had once set a set of keys down next to someone else's plate. I know the company, I said. Not everything yet. Just the first true thing. He was quiet for a long moment. How do you know it? This was the low point, though it didn't feel dramatic the way low points do in the stories Derek's customers probably told each other at the counter. It felt small and exhausting, a 58-year-old man's voice cracking slightly over the phone, asking his estranged daughter for help he didn't yet know she was capable of giving, or withholding. I had spent 15 years building an entire second life specifically, so I would never again have to sit across from my father, and want something from him that he wasn't going to give me. I hadn't planned for the reverse, for him to be the one calling, needing, asking. I thought about hanging up. I thought about telling him the truth right then, all of it, and I thought about how satisfying it might feel to let the silence stretch just a little longer, to let him sit in exactly the kind of uncertainty he'd once let me sit in at that dinner table, fork halfway to my mouth, waiting for an explanation that never came. Some old, unhealed part of me wanted that. I won't pretend it didn't. But underneath that wanting was something quieter, and I think, more honest, the plain fact that I had spent 15 years becoming someone who understood exactly how fragile a business like that was, and exactly what it cost a family when nobody explained the truth in time. I thought about my grandfather's hand-painted sign, peeling now, according to my aunt. I thought about a boy I'd once babysat, 7 years younger than me, who had never asked to be handed a business he wasn't trained to run. I thought about the version of myself that had cried for 20 minutes at a county line, and then decided, quietly, to build instead of beg. I need you to come to the store on Saturday, I told my father. Bring Derek. Don't bring Linda. I'll explain everything then, in person, not like this. He didn't argue. I think some part of him already understood, from the steadiness in my voice, that whatever was coming wasn't a rescue offered casually over the phone. It was something he was going to have to sit down and receive. I hung up and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, not crying this time, just still, doing the quiet arithmetic of a decision I'd apparently already made without fully admitting it to myself. I wasn't calling to negotiate a payment plan. I was calling to finally walk back into that store, 15 years later, and tell them exactly who had been standing underneath it the whole time. Before I went to bed that night, I pulled an old shoebox down from my closet, the kind of box everyone keeps without quite meaning to, and found the brass key my grandfather had given me the summer I turned 9, the one to the store's original delivery van, long since sold, the key itself useless for anything now except what it meant. I put it in my coat pocket. I didn't examine too closely why I wanted it with me on Saturday. Some decisions don't need to be understood in advance. They just need to be made and carried. I got to the store early Saturday morning, before it opened, and let myself sit in my car in the same cracked parking lot I'd noticed on my last visit, looking at the sign my grandfather had hand-painted 62 years earlier. Someone, Derek probably, had touched up the paint at some point, not skillfully, but with obvious care, the letters slightly uneven in a way my grandfather's steady hand had never been. It was, in its own small way, the most honest thing I'd seen from this family in 15 years, an imperfect attempt to keep something alive. My father and Derek were waiting inside when I walked in, standing near the register the way they might have stood waiting for a customer, except the store was still locked, the closed sign still facing out. My father looked older up close than he had in photographs, thinner through the shoulders, his hands, when he reached out briefly like he wasn't sure whether a handshake or a hug was appropriate anymore, visibly unsteady. Derek looked exhausted in the specific way I recognized from my own early years at the bank, the exhaustion of someone carrying a weight they'd never been properly trained to carry. "Thank you for coming," my father said, which felt like such a small, formal thing to say to your own daughter that it almost made me laugh, except nothing about that morning felt remotely funny. I didn't sit down. I stood near the counter, the same counter I'd learned to run a till on when I was 12, and I told them, plainly, without softening it, and without dressing it up in any language gentler than the truth deserved. 15 years ago, you gave this business to Derek at a dinner table, in front of everyone, without ever asking me a single question about what I wanted or what I'd built my whole life toward. I didn't fight you on it. I went home, and I built something else instead, something you never asked about, so I never told you. 6 years ago, this store's mortgage got sold off during a bank restructuring, to a small private lender. That lender was me. A company I own called Willowbend bought the note. I've been the one holding this building's debt for 6 years. I extended for grace periods you never knew about. The letter you got 2 weeks ago came from my company. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I could hear the old wall clock ticking above the register, the same clock, I noticed, that had hung there my entire childhood. My father's face went through several things in quick succession, confusion, then something that looked almost like relief, then, underneath both of those, a kind of grief I hadn't expected and wasn't sure, at first, how to read. "You've owned our mortgage," he said slowly, like he was testing whether the sentence made sense out loud, "for 6 years. And you never said anything. You never asked what I was doing with my life either," I said, and I didn't say it cruelly, though I understood it would land that way regardless. "For 15 years, nobody in this family asked me a single real question about my work. I stopped volunteering the answer because nobody seemed to want it." Derek spoke for the first time, quietly, still looking at the keys sitting in the register drawer, the ones, I realized, that were probably the same keys from that dinner table 15 years earlier. "Elena, I never wanted," he started again. "I didn't ask him to give it to me instead of you. I want you to know that. I've thought about that dinner more times than you probably think I have." "I know," I said, and I meant it. 15 years of distance hadn't erased the fairness of that particular fact. "This isn't about you taking something from me, Derek. It never really was. It's about him deciding, alone, who deserved to be trusted with it." My father sat down heavily on the old wooden stool behind the counter, the one that had probably been there since my grandfather's time, and put his face in his hands for a moment, the unsteadiness in them more visible now than it had been at the door. "I made a mistake," he said, muffled into his palms. "I told myself I was rewarding loyalty. I think, if I'm honest with myself, I was just afraid of losing both of you the way I lost your mother, and I thought giving Derek something permanent would keep him close, and I assumed you'd already left, so there was nothing left to lose there." He looked up. "That was wrong. I understood it was wrong within about a year, and I didn't know how to say so without admitting how badly I'd handled it." I reached into my coat pocket and set the old brass key on the counter between us, the delivery van key, useless now for anything except what it meant, sitting there the way another set of keys once had. "I kept this," I said. "For 15 years. I told myself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing." Nobody said anything for a while after that. Outside, someone tried the locked front door, found it locked, and walked away, presumably a customer arriving before opening hours, unaware that inside, 3 people were quietly rearranging 15 years of silence into something that might eventually become the truth. "So what happens now?" Derek finally asked, his voice steadier than I expected, "with the mortgage? With the store?" That was the real question. The one I'd been driving toward, without fully admitting it to myself, since I read that servicing report 2 weeks earlier. I looked around the store while I thought about how to answer him, at the shelves that were thinner than they used to be, at the handwritten signs taped above certain aisles where Derek had clearly tried to explain product placements he hadn't fully learned yet, at the faded photograph still hanging near the office door of my grandfather standing in front of the store the week it opened in 1962. I thought about 11 properties across 3 counties that I'd chosen, deliberately, not to strangle the way an absentee landlord might, because I understood what it meant to watch something you loved struggle under people who didn't yet understand its numbers. I thought about how strange it was that I had spent 15 years building an entire philosophy of patient ownership around businesses that weren't mine, while the one business that actually was mine, in every sense that mattered, had been drowning less than 3 hours from my apartment, and I hadn't let myself fully look at it until a routine report forced my hand. "I'm not going to foreclose," I said finally, and I watched something visibly loosen in my father's shoulders, the specific relief of a man who had spent 2 weeks preparing for the worst outcome, and hadn't quite dared to hope for anything gentler. "But I'm also not going to keep pretending this is a business that can survive being run the way it's been run for 15 years, out of loyalty instead of strategy. If we're going to fix this, we're going to fix it honestly, with real numbers, the way I would with any business I actually cared about." "We," my father repeated quietly, like the word itself surprised him. "We," I said. "If Derek wants it." This time, though, nobody's deciding anything for anyone else at a dinner table. My father let out a breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding through most of that sentence, and for a moment none of us said anything, the old wall clock still ticking above the register, the closed sign still facing the empty parking lot. I thought about how strange it was that the room felt lighter now than it had when I walked in, even though nothing had actually been resolved yet, no paperwork signed, no numbers finalized, nothing but a handful of sentences exchanged across a counter I'd once learned to run a till on. Maybe that was the part nobody warns you about, I thought. That the hardest sentence to say out loud isn't the confession itself. It's the offer that comes right after it, the one that risks being refused. Derek looked at me for a long moment, and I watched him decide something, not quickly, not performatively, but the way a person decides something they've been circling for a while without saying it out loud. "I don't know how to run this place the way it needs to be run," he said. "I've known that for at least 3 years and been too proud, or too scared, to say it to anyone, including myself. I kept thinking if I just worked harder, it would fix itself. It didn't. It wasn't going to," I said, not unkindly. "Working harder isn't the same as understanding the margins on slow-moving inventory, or knowing which supplier terms are actually negotiable. Nobody taught you that. Dad taught me that, for 20 years, because I happened to be the one standing next to him in the back office. That's not a character flaw of yours. It's a training gap, and training gaps can be closed." My father shifted on the stool, and I could see him wanting to say something, working up to it the way he'd worked up to that speech at the dinner table 15 years earlier, except this time, there was nothing rehearsed in his face. "I have to say this properly," he said. "Elena, I am sorry. Not the way I was sorry in my head for years, telling myself I'd make it right eventually. Actually sorry, out loud, to your face, for deciding you didn't need to be asked. You spent your whole childhood earning a place in this business, and I erased that in about 4 sentences at a dinner table because I was afraid of losing your brother the way geography almost lost you, and I never once considered that the way I handled it would end up costing me both of you in different ways for 15 years. I let that sit for a moment before I answered, because I didn't want my response to come from the reflexive part of me that still, after everything, wanted to make him feel better the instant he looked pained. "I believe that you're sorry," I said. "I don't think I need you to grovel, and I don't think that's what this moment is for. But I do need you to understand something clearly, because I don't think you ever have. What you did wasn't a small oversight. It was a decision that told me, in the clearest terms possible, that 20 years of proof didn't matter as much as proximity did. I built an entire second life proving the decision wrong, and some part of me is glad I did, because if you hadn't handed this place to Derek that night, I don't know that I ever would have found out what I was actually capable of on my own. So this whole thing," my father said slowly, "everything you built, Harrow Creek, all of it. That happened because of that dinner." "It happened despite that dinner," I corrected him. "There's a difference, and I need you to hear it. I don't owe that night anything. I don't owe it my success, and I'm not going to let it get credit for who I became, like the cruelty was secretly a gift. It wasn't a gift. It was a wound, and I built something good in spite of it, not because of it. Derek was quiet through most of this, but when he spoke again, his voice had steadied into something I hadn't heard from him before, not the uncertain 23-year-old holding keys he hadn't earned, and not the exhausted man I'd walked in on that morning, but something closer to the person underneath both of those versions. What do you actually want, Elena? Not the mortgage. Not the business logistics. What do you want from us going forward? It was, I realized, the first time in 15 years anyone in that family had asked me a direct question about what I wanted and then actually waited, silently, for the real answer. I want the mortgage restructured on fair terms, terms I'd offer any struggling small business, not favors and not punishment, I said. I want to help you rebuild the parts of this operation that are actually broken: inventory management, supplier negotiation, the back office side nobody ever taught you. I'm willing to do that as a formal advisor, maybe eventually as a partner, if that's something you both actually want, and not just something you're agreeing to out of guilt or exhaustion. And I want, going forward, for this family to ask each other real questions before making decisions that reshape someone else's entire life. That's it. That's the whole list. My father nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd walked in that morning, he looked less like a man bracing for bad news and more like a man who had, against his own expectations, been offered something close to grace. That's more generous than I deserve, he said. Probably, I said. I'm doing it anyway. Derek let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for longer than just that conversation, maybe for 3 years, maybe for 15. I'd like that, he said. The advisor part. All of it, honestly. I don't want to keep pretending I know how to do this alone when I clearly don't. He paused and something almost like a smile broke through the exhaustion on his face. For what it's worth, I always thought you'd have made a better owner than me. I just never had the nerve to say that to Dad. You didn't need to say it, I told him. It wasn't your job to fix his decision. It was his. My father looked at both of us then, back and forth, the way he might have looked at 2 ledgers he was finally reading correctly for the first time in 15 years. Then let's start over, he said. Properly this time. All 3 of us at the table, deciding together. I picked the brass key up off the counter and turned it over once in my palm, the way Derek had once turned over a set of keys he hadn't asked for. Properly, I agreed. This time, everyone gets a seat before the decision gets made, not after. Outside, the parking lot was starting to fill with the first customers of the morning, unaware that the store they were about to walk into had just quietly changed hands from silence to something closer to honesty. We restructured the mortgage the following month, through Willowbend, on the same terms I would have offered any small business owner willing to do the work of turning things around: an extended amortization schedule, a temporary reduction in monthly payments while the store rebuilt its inventory margins, and a clear, written plan with milestones we all agreed to, rather than the vague hope that things would simply improve because a family member had finally stepped in. I didn't do it quietly this time, through an anonymous entity. I did it under my own name, sitting across from my father and Derek at the same counter where I'd once learned to run a till, all 3 of us signing the same document. Over the next year, I drove home most weekends, not out of obligation, but because I genuinely wanted to be part of rebuilding something I'd once thought I'd lost for good. I helped Derek renegotiate 2 supplier contracts that had been quietly draining the store's margins for years. I taught him, the way my father had once taught me, how to read a cash flow statement, how to spot a slow-moving inventory problem before it became a crisis, how to say no to a customer's credit request without losing the relationship. He was, I discovered, a faster learner than either of us had given him credit for, once someone actually sat down and taught him the parts of the business nobody had bothered to explain 15 years earlier. By the following spring, the store had turned its first profitable quarter in almost 4 years. My relationship with my father didn't heal all at once, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one sometimes make reconciliation sound faster and cleaner than it actually is. We had at least 2 more difficult conversations that year, one where I told him, plainly, that that I still carried real anger about that dinner table, anger that a restructured mortgage and a sincere apology couldn't fully dissolve on their own, and one where he told me, just as plainly, that he understood, and that he wasn't asking me to pretend otherwise just to make the relationship easier for him. That honesty, more than the apology itself, was what finally let something between us start to mend. Not fully, but honestly, which turned out to matter more. There was one more conversation that mattered, one I haven't mentioned yet, that happened almost a year to the day after that Saturday morning. My father asked me why I'd never told him about Harrow Creek Holdings at all, in 15 years, not even the ordinary version of it, the version with no hidden mortgage attached. I told him the truth, that after a while, silence had simply become easier than explaining something to people who had stopped asking. He nodded and didn't try to defend himself further, which I think was its own kind of apology. Linda and I never quite found our way to anything warm, and I've made peace with that. Some relationships, once fractured by 15 years of unspoken favoritism, don't fully repair, and I don't think they have to, in order for the rest of a family to move forward. I see her at holidays now. We're polite. That's enough. Derek and I found something neither of us expected. Not just a working partnership, though it became that too, formally, about 18 months after that Saturday morning, when I bought in as a minority partner under fair, transparent terms we negotiated together, with an actual lawyer this time, and an actual conversation about what each of us wanted, instead of a decision made unilaterally over dessert. What we found underneath the business arrangement was something closer to an actual relationship between siblings, one built, ironically, on the very thing our father had failed to give either of us 15 years earlier, the assumption that we were both capable, both worth consulting, both entitled to a seat at the table before decisions got made about our own lives. I think about that dinner table often, still, even now. I've stopped being angry at the memory itself, though I haven't forgotten a single detail of it, the manila envelope, the good plates, the 4 words that reorganized my entire understanding of my place in that family. What I've come to understand in the years since, is that the 4 words themselves were never really the injustice. He's the one who stayed, was just a symptom of the deeper problem, a father who mistook a decision made alone for a decision made wisely, who confused loyalty with proximity, and who never once considered that fairness required asking, not assuming. If there's a single thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take with them, it's this: the people who love you don't always show it by asking the right questions at the right time. Sometimes they show it by making a decision they believe is right, without ever checking whether it actually is. That doesn't make the hurt less real. But it also doesn't have to be the end of the story. I spent 15 years building a life 200 miles from that dinner table, and in the end, it wasn't revenge that brought me back to that counter. It was the simple, stubborn fact that I still cared enough to want it done right, even after everything. The store still has my grandfather's hand-painted sign above the door, touched up now with a steadier hand than Derek's first attempt, painted properly this past spring by someone who actually knew how to do it, me on a Sunday afternoon, with Derek holding the ladder and my father, older now but steadier too, sitting on the same wooden stool behind the counter, watching us both. A year after we signed that restructuring agreement, my father asked me, almost shyly, whether I still had the old brass key from the delivery van. I told him I did. He asked if I'd consider putting it back in the store somewhere, not hidden this time, not carried quietly in a coat pocket for 15 years, but out in the open, where it could mean what it was always supposed to mean instead of what it had become. We mounted it in a small frame near the register, next to the faded photograph of my grandfather standing in front of the store the week it opened. Customers ask about it sometimes. Derek tells them it belonged to the first Marsh who ever ran this place, which is true, and leaves it at that, which I've come to appreciate more than any grand explanation could offer. Some stories don't need to be told in full to every stranger who walks through the door. They just need to be kept somewhere true, where the people who matter can find them when they're ready to ask. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the one who left, or the one who stayed, or the one who had to decide, alone, what fairness actually looked like, tell me in the comments where you'd have stood at that table. And if you want more stories like this one, stay close. There are quieter reckonings than this still waiting to be told.